welcome you to this session of the QM East Coast Regional Conference entitled Accessible Accessibility, Making Sense of Specific Review Standard 8.3 in the APPQMR. So please join me in welcoming your presenter, who will now introduce himself and begin the presentation.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Vaughan. Can you hear me okay? Are we still in good shape on the audio?
I believe so, yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, thank you all for making the time. I actually don't know exactly how many people we have on the call today, but I will absolutely trust that we'll be seeing each other in the chat feature very soon. My name is Matthew Vaughan, and I'm one of the instructional designers at Columbia University School of Professional Studies. And what that means is that I, along with several of my colleagues, one of whom presented earlier today at an incredibly good presentation on learning styles, we work with faculty in a number of different programs. I am the face-to-face APPQMR facilitator for our institution, though. And so we are going to be talking today really in a very much of a drill down into some very, very QM-centric items. So whereas Dave's presentation was about learning styles, and the very, very exciting presentation that was immediately preceding mine about different approaches to design, that's not really what we're going to talk about here today. It's very, very much about the APPQMR. So let's dive right in. All right, there we go. What I wanted to make sure everybody knows is that all of the presentation documentation for this session is available at that tiny URL that you'll see at the bottom of your screens. So tinyurl.com/QMDocs. It'll bring you to a page that looks exactly like this. You can see my slide deck. You can also see the APPQMR agenda from some of them. Now that's of course a dated one, so they may change that. And then I've also gone ahead and included the slides from the APPQMR right here and numbered them for your ease of reference if you wanted to see them while I'm talking about any of them. So hopefully that'll be a resource for you to use, and that URL will remain good. So again, it's tinyurl.com/QMDocs. So let's talk about what we'll be doing in the next 45 minutes or so. First off, I want to review the learning objectives and the intended audience for this presentation. Two, I want to just do a quick thing with the chat, get a brief tone-setting feedback discussion going, very, very minor, very, very quick. And then talk to you about the premise of what this assignment was all about, or what this task presentation was all about. Because the two main goals I want to do here is to sort of complexify the APPQMR a little bit. And if you've ever facilitated the APPQMR, you know it's already very complex. But I want to just basically tease out a few things that I'm noticing as an experienced facilitator and get your feedback on it. Then I want to suggest a way forward for how to teach specifically slides 61 through 78 in the APPQMR that deal with how to draft helpful recommendations, searching for whether or not 7.1 and 8.3 have been met, and a whole host of corollary items that go around with those. So we're going to talk about those each in turn. I'm going to basically show you two different ways to teach it, the right way and the less is more way, which we'll talk about. And then I'm going to drill down into my own little way of facilitating it, the less is more way. Talk to you about some of the rationales that I've included in making these kind of recommendations. And then we'll open it up for feedback. My guess is that knowing the folks at QM as well as I do, you're going to have comments, statements, questions, declarations, etc. about the ideas that I'm throwing out here, and I would love to hear them. Because really, I hope you'll see this as an experiment in trying to meet the very, very reasonable goals of the APPQMR, while at the same time realizing some of the limitations that it provides to facilitation and to participation, very frankly. All right, that being said, here are our objectives for today. We're going to recognize key issues for teaching or facilitating. I'll probably use those words synonymously, but of course they're not the same word. I really mean facilitation, which is what we really do in the APPQMR. But we basically are bucketing out these three key issues, related to the three buckets, namely how to write recommendations, 7.1 and 8.3. So we're going to talk about those in turn. I want to, in the process, interpret the rubric and the annotation a little bit, because I think it actually lends itself very nicely to some interpretation and thereby some alternative ways of thinking about the rubric. And then 3, I want us to begin the task of crafting a personal plan for teaching in the APPQMR. As you know, if you've ever facilitated the APPQMR, you've got like just stacks and stacks of paper that you're constantly looking through and going for. I keep a notebook, whenever I'm going. And so what I'm hoping we can do is talk about some of the tools you can put into your notebook and have at the ready for when you're facilitating this workshop. It's really intended for 4 groups of people rather. One, and most prominently, your APPQMR facilitators. People who are actually on the ground facilitating the face-to-face iteration of this incredibly seminal workshop for QM work. 2, by definition, you're also going to want to incorporate your QM coordinators in things of this sort because they're going to have opinions about how you cover, when you cover, what you cover. I think master reviewers could always use a repeat of some of the overarching themes that the APPQMR does. So just throwing that one in there. And then also I would say anybody that's interested in storyboarding for face-to-face instruction. We're going to talk about that as one of the tools in the toolbox I'm going to be presenting to you here in just a little while. Allowing us to sort of get one more little lesson planning piece to our arsenal, if you will, for when we go in and facilitate this workshop. Okay, so I'm going to start this off with a very, very brief. You can just use the chat feature. No need to get a poll going or something like that. But this chunk of about 17 slides really introduces, as we were saying, or as I was saying, those 3 main buckets. How to write a helpful recommendation, SRS 7.1, which has to do with learner support, SRS 8.3, which has to do with accessibility. My question to you, and I would just open it up to anybody in the group, which of these 3 topics is, as you understand it, more important for the APPQMR workshop as you facilitate it, and why? Obviously, they're all 3 very important, and we'll talk about how and why. But if there were a hierarchy or a center of gravity, what would you put in there? I'll ask that and then come back. All right, learner support. What else? Well, we got 1 vote for learner support. We're also going to, yeah, absolutely. Remember when you're presenting a question, you can make sure and write it out to all panelists so that we can all read it. Well, one of the things I am finding as I've read and reread this documentation over and again is that not only do I have a different center of gravity every time I look at each of these things, but actually the QM sort of ethos in the documentation itself, the rubric and the notes, gives a center of gravity for us. It really privileges how to write helpful recommendations as one of the central aims of these 3 items, and we're going to talk about what specifically they say about that here in just a second. Okay, so here's what they say. This is taken verbatim from the documentation. Participants will learn more about how to draft a helpful recommendation in QM terms and about general standards 7 and 8, which focus on support, accessibility, and usability for online learners. Participants will consider the 2 specific standards we've been talking about. They'll apply the rubric, cite evidence from SBS 3053, and then draft a helpful recommendation. Participants will be required to submit the recommendation he or she wrote to the facilitator to be marked as successful for the workshop. That is a lot. I mean, a lot to do in what actually ends up being about 1 hour. So if you look at the APPQMR agenda, that again is in this little collection of documents, you'll see that you only get 2:15 to 3:15 during which to introduce this concept. You're drafting helpful recommendations under which they put an introduction of 7.1 and 8.3. Now, talk about why that's an important issue here in just a second. But first, let's drill down a little bit further into each of the 3 components that are covered here at this time in the workshop. First off, drafting helpful recommendations. This is arguably the most difficult concept I would posit. It's the most difficult concept for new QM participants, i.e. those who are actually taking the APPQMR. I can't tell you how many times I have spent the bulk of my day in the APPQMR wrestling with some of the language, the terms, and the scope that people bring to the table when they are trying to write helpful recommendations for the first time. Mastery of that skill is, by the way, central to the aims and function of the PRC, which comes after the APPQMR. And I would argue that, honestly, the bulk of the PRC really is all about making your recommendations better. I mean, it's probably its central goal. Participants will realistically, in the APPQMR, only scratch the surface, you know? But I want to argue that the initial feedback we provide in the APPQMR is going to set the tone for the PRC in some really meaningful ways. And it's going to not only do that, it's going to help orient our learners, our participants, and some of our colleagues to the concepts that QM, I think, rather reasonably brings to the table. So then that's not only do we have this behemoth of an objective here, then we have two really important SRSs to cover. 7.1, quote, the course introductions articulate or link to a clear description of the technical support offered and how to obtain it. So going back to what Mursalata, I'm sorry if I'm saying your name incorrectly, I apologize, who was arguing at the very beginning of this in our tone setter here, that learner support is actually one of the most important things we do as facilitators of APPQMR. I quite agree. You could spend an hour working on that easily. And talk about one you could spend an hour working on is 8.3. The course provides accessible text and images in files, documents, LMS pages, and web pages to meet the needs of diverse learners. No small task, I would argue. No small task. Now, I've titled this slide very appropriately. SRS 7.1 is no minor consideration because discerning whether or not this standard is met is often really complex, and different institutions handle this particular feature very differently. And so, you know, I've taken this text straight from the annotation, so I'm not going to read it all to you, but I mean, examples of the things people could be looking for to discern whether or not 7.1 is met is really a lot of stuff. You know, a clear description, an email link might look very different than an embedded ticketing system, might look very different than just a phone number and address, might look very different from any other form by which you would submit these things. So or this frequently asked questions page, somebody's got to write those questions, somebody's got to moderate that, somebody's got to answer those questions in coherent, technically precise language. It's just a lot of work. But nothing is as much work in the rubric as 8.3 is. 8.3 is, in my opinion, now this, we're leaving the realm of Matthew speaks on behalf of everything to the realm of Matthew speaks on behalf only of himself. And I will say that I think accessibility is appropriately becoming one of the most contentious but also important issues in online learning. And that's this general question of, are we generating content that alienates the very people our online promise attempts to include? I think is a really important one that's going to face online education moving forward for years and years to come. I know where I'm at in Columbia, we talk about this all the time. We frequently are making tweaks to our design, tweaks to our templates, tweaks to our practices, tweaks to our descriptions of technology support and things like that based on the accessibility initiatives we're trying to put in. But accessibility concerns are outrageously complicated because they have to do with blending what I would call your pedagogy, your tech savvy, and your understanding of learner support, because it really ties back into 7.1 in so many ways. It's also complicated because, you know, you're utilizing native accessibility checkers within your LMS. So it's not only your own tech savvy, it's the tech limitation oftentimes of your LMS that you have to think about. And then finally, not finally, just throwing some things out here, is that protecting institutions against legal action on accessibility issues is, of course, a major concern for all of us who have a future stake in online learning. which in this post-COVID world is likely to be, you know, an even bigger one. I hope so. So now as we drill down into talking about 8.3, namely notions of accessibility, I just want to pause and look at slide, I believe it's 76. Because on slide 76, you will find that there are 76. That there are not only links to getting into the SBS 3053 site, there are also instructions for you to go to a specific module, which is of course a helpful thing. But then they give you these 2 links. They're both tiny URLs. That's where I got the idea to do tiny URL. Thank you, QA people. But let me see if I can find a diagram. I'll find it here in a second. But what I'm trying to say is this slide right here introduces, in my opinion, some of the most complicated material in the entire APPQMR day. There we go. This is the one I was looking for. Slide 76 links to supplemental resources on SRS 8.3, which include an 11-slide soft chalk intro to SRS 8.3. That's what this looks like, with 9 distinct topics covered in those 11 slides. It also hits you right at the end of the day. So, you know, 215 to 315, you've already gone over everything at the APPQMR, like the nature of the scoring system, the overviews of each of the 8 buckets in which we've clustered these standards, the general standards. You've talked about learning objectives and then of all of the complexities that go into general standard 2. You know, it's just a lot of material that's coming at people. This is right after lunch. It's the last major, you know, sort of learning moment of the APPQMR. And in my opinion, it is absolutely the most crucial. The complexity of each of those 2 SRSs, 7.1 or 8.3 alone, in my opinion, would make this a certainly a tough lift for a 1-hour presentation. But when you add on to it that this is the form in which they want you to write your helpful recommendations and to get better at that and introduce that skill, in my opinion, it's just too much. And here's one of the reasons why it's too much. Let's look at what the key issues are just for 8.3 that you see teased out in these 9 topics. Things like the accessibility of Word documents, the accessibility of PDFs, the accessibility of linked pages, thereby, you know, meaning that you're digging into HTML concerns. Use and format and function of color. I think there's tons to talk about there. Some of the technologists on staff at Columbia, we talk a lot about color and color dynamics, contrast ratios and things like that. So what I'm trying to say is this is just too much to try to do in 1 hour. And to try to do right in 1 hour. So let's talk a little bit, and actually maybe before I dive into this here, maybe I should just pause. I see a couple of folks have reacted to the chat box, and if you don't have anything particularly pressing to say right now, I think that's perfectly fine, but I just want to stop, and before I go into the notion of crafting a personal plan for teaching, I want to just stop and see if there are any questions.
No questions in the
No questions on me.
Q&A
All right.
box or chat, looks like so.
Then let's dive on in. Okay. So I'm going to be presenting to you what I understand to be QM's right way for how to facilitate this. And then I'm going to give you what I call my less is more option, which is being a little bit more selective about the information we cover and rethink some of the activities. I call them assignments there. That's just my, I've been writing learning activities for the past few weeks, and that's what we call them here at Columbia. So, okay, so let's talk about the right way. In order to do that, I want to use this tool right here, the CUSPS storyboard. Now, this right here is just a very simple Very, very low tech. In fact, I did all of it with pen and paper to prove how low tech this is, because this is actually for facilitating in a face-to-face environment. So a little pen and paper never hurt anybody. And what I've done is I've taken this exact storyboard and I've scripted it out in the right way and the less is more way. But I have given you this storyboard in the documentation within this presentation if you wanted to use it. I mean, this is not an outrageously complicated one. There are tons of different storyboarding tools out there. But you can see, I think this is a really basic one that talks about time, topic, visuals, and interaction. Very, very, bare bones. And so let's dive in and see what it looks like to teach this stuff, again, to facilitate the APPQMR, quote, the right way. Now, when I use the term right way, I mean it in 3 different ways. 1, all QM scripted content is covered. 2, all activities accomplished exactly as the script dictates. And 3, the timing, namely keeping it all to the 60 minutes, is going to be more or less honored. Okay, so here's my storyboard for the right way. The right way is in blue, the less is more way is in black. What we've got here, again, my name, the course is just the APPQMR, it's no session date, whatever. I have 2 objectives, right? It's really the 3 because I've got the drafting helper recommendations and then SRS 7.1, SRS 8.3. But I've broken them out into, if you'll see on the left-hand side, into 20-minute chunks. So what we've got here is, very much making everything count equally, okay? So you give 20 minutes to recommendations, 20 minutes to 7.1, and 20 minutes to 8.3. Now that might seem very doable, but we're going to drill down into why that's problematic here in a sec. Slides, what students are going to see or participants are going to see is not going to change. Frankly, neither is the topic. So in my less is more way, I've kept those, for all intents and purposes, the same. The interactions I've decided to tweak a little bit, and the timing I've tweaked a little bit. But the topic and the visuals don't change at all. But let's drill down, because the issue is not necessarily the complexity, only the complexity of the concepts you have to introduce. It's also how laborious, time-intensive, and involved all of the activities are. Okay, so the right way has this series of activities, okay? 16, 17, 20, and 23, in my opinion, stand on their own as really robust activities. 18 and 19, I think, are basically the same thing. And 21 and 22 are also very similarly structured. So I went ahead and combined those 2, but if you wanted to write them out differently, you could. These are the slides on which you can find them. And again, I just want to draw your attention to the fact that all of the slides are indeed available right here with the numbers right there. I do not give the speaker notes, mostly because I thought that may be a little overkill. But you'll see all of the activities, their prompts, any of their necessary text, they're all going to be available to you in the resources for this presentation. Now, a couple of things I want to draw your attention to. First off, we're going to keep this to an hour. We're going to keep this to 2:15 to 3:15. It means by definition, you're going to have best case scenario time use on all of your activities. And that means putting at 6 distinct buckets. Well, 6 buckets of activity in 60 minutes, you do the math right there. That's about it. It's about all you have time to do in the APPQMR. And that's presupposing what I'm calling a best time case scenario. So for example, analyzing a recommendation, at best, you're going to be able to do that in 5 minutes. All right, I'll answer that question in a second. So this and this are the same thing. The right way in blue right here, and this are the exact same thing, which is why I've got right way up at the top. This is just a way to break down the activities that are affiliated within those slides. And this is not only the activities, but also the slide numbers, the learning objectives, and the timing. So you're given 5 minutes for the analyzing of a recommendation, and then only 8 minutes to improve 5 recommendations. I've never been able to do this activity in 8 minutes. It's just too long. It takes people a longer time to sort of think about it. They're typically working with their neighbor. They're talking, they've got questions. It's just really, really hard to do in this amount of time. Deciding whether or not 7.1 and 8.3 are met, my goodness. If you can decide that in 16 minutes total, whew, that is really fast. And that's fast if you're doing a formal review, much less if you've never really done QM work before, or you're still learning your way around SBS 3053, etc. Then you've got the two activities on here, namely numbers 20 and 23, that I actually would argue are the most time intensive of all of them. You've got two instances where you have to actually write out a recommendation. You ever tried to do one of those from scratch? It's not easy. And it's certainly not easy if you've not done it before, which is why I say you give that one 10 minutes. So if you add all of that up, that comes to about 49 minutes of activity. Best case, so about 50 minutes of activity and 10 minutes of intermittent facilitation. These are the implications. This is the implications of the right way. You don't really have any time for any tech or logistics hiccups. You don't have a ton of time for discussion or collaboration. And I think most importantly, you don't have any time for coaching in the activities. This right here, this right way presupposes all of these best case scenario things. And at the end of the day, I have just found that one to be a really tough pill to swallow. Certainly not impossible, but I think there are better ways of doing it. So here's the long and short, and this is sort of my thesis where we're leading into this less is more that I want to present to you here in a second. The QM has just given us too much content to cover responsibly in 1 hour. This is not to say that the content should not be covered. This is not to say that it's irresponsible. It's just to say it's just too much stuff to be able to do in 1 hour and to just really knock it out of the park. So your face-to-face APPQMR facilitator should think less about, maybe checking the boxes, if you will, than about generating some of that lasting learning that Dave was talking about earlier about, where we're talking about things that are actually made for learning. So that being said, and I see we've also got someone weighing in on learning styles. Absolutely. These kinds of things, particularly when you're doing it really, really quickly in class, it doesn't give you the opportunity, very frankly, to differentiate your instruction to be able to meet the needs of diverse learners, even in the APPQMR workshop, which just is going to be a little extra time. I don't want to come across as being critical to QM here because we've got a lot of really great things we have to cover. I'm just trying to say that trying to cover those really, really chunky things in an hour is probably going to be quite the lift. So here is my my storyboard for the less is more way. Okay. So instead of, all right, so you'll notice the session objectives, what we're going to be talking about, and the visuals, those don't change at all because I would never want to change the objectives of a QM presentation. And we certainly can't to be part of the APPQMR certification. But I would say we need to devote only about 10 minutes at the beginning of that hour to the recommendations because you're going to have an opportunity to return to that later. Then do about maybe 20 minutes on SRS 7.1 and then do a full half hour on 8.3. That's how I would recommend it instead of doing it 20, 20, 20. Now, QM doesn't necessarily say you have to do it in equal stages. That was my inference in the right way. But we're left to make these inferences as facilitators. And one of the things I think is really important to note about that inference that you have to make is that we're all, as facilitators, having to make judgment calls at every single moment in the day to what are we gonna skip over or skim over? What are we gonna, how does the clock impact us here and now, et cetera. You don't want to do that too much, obviously, because you don't want to risk missing some of the content, but APPQMR facilitators constantly have to make these kinds of judgment calls. So this is one way I would suggest to do it. Now, the reason why I wrote it out by hand instead of typing it out is to make it feel like a work in progress, because it is. And anytime you teach the APPQMR, you're going to get better. You're going to tweak it. You're going to get more comfortable with the documentation, and in that way, I think it really does serve our institutions. Let's do a little bit of a more drill down into the activities of. So going back to Mursalada's good question to differentiate what I'm doing on my slides here. So my handwritten storyboards are the sort of overarching way I would go about facilitating. And then these tables here are a drill down into the actual activities themselves. And here's what I would recommend. Now, this is absolutely a recommendation. But activity 16, where you're analyzing a recommendation, you can either scrap it or do it really, really quickly with the group. It's not something I would recommend you giving a ton of time to, because you are analyzing other recommendations throughout parts of the day. It's not like this is the only moment, even in the day, during which you could analyze a recommendation. And then I would definitely, however, keep activity 17. Improving recommendations is a crucial skill, because you want to make sure that when people hear a recommendation that's not helpful, that immediately sends off all sorts of red flags for them. That immediately says, oh no, something didn't go right here. This is not the way a recommendation is supposed to sound. They're supposed to be constructive. They're supposed to be specific. You know, they're supposed to be balanced. And your recommendation wasn't. Let's talk about how we can make that better. I think activity 17 is a really important one for the APPQMR. And I would recommend, if you're going to keep any 2 points on that one, I would recommend keeping in activity 17, and this is on slide 68, number 2, which says, you didn't tell the learners which resources were optional. It's not a helpful recommendation. Let's fix that. I like that one as one, because it really does speak to a lot of the concerns in General Standard 4, and will allow you to speak to things like publication materials and things like that in your recommendations, which I always found very tricky. And then number 4, or number 5, frankly, the learning objectives aren't measurable, or your assignments or assessments rather are weak. You know, any of those things, rewriting them would be a helpful thing to do. Okay, now, activities 18 and 19, however, basically all you're trying to do in 18 and 19 is to discern whether or not the SBS 3053 meets 7.1. You can do this one live and with your panelists really easily if you had to save some time. You know, having it up on the projector, for example, walking them through it, asking for guidance. Where should I go now? Where might we look? Et cetera, et cetera. It might be a really, really nice way to shorten this activity, to keep it, of course, but to shorten it. Then I would definitely recommend, that activities 20 and 23, where you're drafting recommendations, just keep those in their entirety as they are. And if you do that, you'll have more time to use on those activities in the APPQMR itself, which means they're going to get more out of it. So those I would recommend tweaking in the slightest. And then your activity 8.3 about does the SRS, meet standards? Excuse me, does the course meet the SRS 8.3 standard? I think that's a judgment call that you would have to make, keeping in mind all of the complexities that we've talked about with regard to 8.3. I mean, there are just a lot of things you could be able to show people. And in my opinion, it would be a great, great way for you to introduce concepts like alt tagging, information hierarchy in HTML, things like that. If you were to walk students through that as part of your facilitation of the APPQMR, I really do think that's going to be a helpful introduction to the SRS. That's just going to take time. And that walkthrough can be done as you do activity number 21 and 22. But just as to put a pin in this one, I'll just reiterate, I think the writing of recommendations, this plan honors the objectives that QM set out for us in the first place. Because what it does is it prioritizes the writing of recommendations and subsumes 7.1 and 8.3 up under it. That's what I've tried to do in this less is more way, is honor the aims and objectives of QM, even while being realistic of the limitations that this amount of complicated material can provide. Okay, one last slide before I finish up. So here were some of my rationales. This is my teaching philosophy in a lot of ways, and it's things that have impacted the way in which I've thought about QM and the APPQMR. One, I think Matthew Vaughan thinks that it is better to cover one topic in depth than several surface skims. And in this particular case, I think QM has been pretty clear to us. They want us to cover the drafting of helpful recommendations. So I would rather cover that one in depth and not shorten anything, not cut any corners on that, because I really do feel like that's where QM wants us to go. But then that's going to mean that one of the key fundamental goals for every APPQMR face-to-face facilitator is going to be making sure folks know how to get to these resource documents. They're going to help explain things like SRS 8.3. Making it clear, for example, how to get to that soft chalk page, how to get to that 13-minute series of YouTube videos where you go in there and watch them open up some pages and click around and show you how it all looks and feels on a page. Having participants know exactly where to go to get to that is a major deal. I think, going back to my previous point, using the draft to helpful recommendation mandate as the central one, I think will provide you with an infrastructure to do all the other objectives, is what I'm trying to say. It will allow you to meet every one of those needs. And I want to be clear. I think that we can do everything that we want to do if we're just intentional about it during the APPQMR. I see no reason to try to come across saying that we can't do everything we want to do. I think we absolutely can. Okay, so just a brief recap of the things we've talked about thus far, and then I will stop with 10 minutes left and we can talk if everybody's game to do so. And if not, I'll let you have 10 minutes of your afternoon back. But today we've talked a little bit about reviewing essentially some learning objectives and our intended audiences. We talked a little bit about some of the things you think are the most important aspects of this. We've introduced storyboarding. Hopefully we've complexified some aspects of the APPQMR and for facilitating the APPQMR. And I've provided one way that you could drill down and teach these concepts, and make it count in that hour. You have to cut a few corners, but it'll all be there. So that being said, let's stop. If I know anything about QM folks, I know that at least one or two folks have got some opinions, good, bad, or ugly. So that being said, with 10 minutes left in the session, what are some general thoughts you have about my suggestions here? And perhaps what would you recommend for how to cover this amount of content? The APPQMR has got to be tweaked constantly. They're making changes to it. So what would you recommend? Knowing what you know now, listening to me wax philosophic about how hard I think it is to do, does this change anything? And then a third question to just keep in mind is whether or not you feel like the less is more way does indeed retain the objectives that QM sets out for us. I think you can make an argument that in some ways it does not, and I would push back on that, but I would welcome the discussion nonetheless. So anyway, I'm going to just stop right there and see if there are any questions. I'm exactly at 40 minutes of rambling away. So I'll stop right there and say thank you for your attention and for those people that have commented thus far. But right now I will leave it to you.
Thanks, Matthew. Just want to say thank you for your presentation. And I know that you may have some questions coming in or some comments.
And if not, that's okay too. We can all use a Friday afternoon happy hour.
Definitely. I almost forgot it was Friday, right?
Yeah, and I'm the last one on the book. So once you're done with this, everybody, you can go on home and go. But well, actually, you're already home already. So you can go about your days nonetheless. Well, let me just say, since we don't seem to have a ton of questions, and I appreciate, Marissa, a lot of your comments as well during the presentation. Let me just say that I've thought a lot about the APPQMR as writing this out. And I really feel like the APPQMR is one of the most important things that APPQM does. I love it. I think it's a really, really good resource. I call it the boot camp for all things QM is how I sell it at Columbia. And every single time we do the APPQMR, we get tons of great feedback from our faculty and administrators. And I'm confident that one of the reasons why is because so much of this content is relevant to the actual teaching and learning that goes on at Columbia. And that was why I wanted to do this project, because I take the APPQMR so seriously. I just think that 1 hour is just too cluttered. We got to shorten it a little bit. So anyway, thanks Dave, thanks Morsalata for your comments. I guess Jill, if no objections are had, I'll end 9 minutes early then.
Sounds good. Thank you, Matthew. I will
All right, thank you all so much again, and I look forward to connecting on the interwebs.